Blythewood Sanitarium opened as a private institution for the mentally disturbed in 1905 in Stamford, Connecticut. Established for wealthy patients as a partial escape from New York City, the facility was built on 50 acres of wooded land, split down the middle by a stream which led to a nearby pond. At its peak, Blythewood had 8 main buildings, 8 cottages, a chapel, an occupational therapy building, and a small golf course. It also has a dark history, which seemingly marks it as a forced retirement home for New York City crime syndicates. Blythewood also housed the first wife, Dorothy Millette, of the murdered Hollywood executive Paul Bern, he of Jean Harlow husband fame. Blythewood was not like the other sanitariums of Connecticut, including Brooklyn Farm and Crestview. It was exclusive, catering to many wealthy socialites, and costing nearly $200 a week in 1924, which is nearly $4,000 today. But many patients stayed for free. The patients were housed in 4 buildings at Blythewood, whose name translated means forest lacking due thought. The main front building, described as a gracious mansion with white columns, was the original house of the estate belonging to New York City power magnate Boss Tweed. The administrative center contained doctors' offices and a graduate house for patients soon to be discharged. The Forest Building was the main residence and services building of Blythewood. It was 3 stories tall, with clapboard siding, large brick chimneys at either end, and green awnings above the windows. There was also a medical facilities unit and the occupational building, where patients could do arts and crafts or play piano. According to an account from Mrs. Marty Mann, who jump-started Alcoholics Anonymous from Blythewood, patients were sent into a lock-up house for observation after being admitted. Screams could occasionally be heard from this lock-up house, where patients were indeed locked up by the wrists. Violent patients were moved into the Violent House, a small building far from the road. Patients were sometimes brought to this house in an ambulance and were restrained. Closer to the road was the Middle House. It had 2 floors, a finished attic, common rooms, and a small central dining room. Mann also accounts, though the sanitarium had been established as primarily a psychiatric facility, its location in Greenwich was ironic regarding services to alcoholics. Greenwich at the time included many from New York City's social scenes, and so it catered to a class of people who wanted to overcome their alcoholism. The town, a moneyed, educated, urbane bedroom community of New York City, had a reputation for widespread inebriety. As late as 1979, the problem of alcoholism was so pronounced that national study, reported in the Greenwich Time of July 1979, called Greenwich the alcoholic capital of America, second only perhaps to certain valleys in California. The facility closed for some time in the 1960s after a series of fires and was demolished, but the chapel was preserved and still remains next to the Greenwich Baptist Church. Another building of Blythewood became a middle school. The New York Times published a summary of Blythewood in 1936 when its founder, William Wiley Sr., died. Here is that recollection. Dr. William Herbert Wiley, founder of the Blythewood Sanitarium, died at his home in Stanwich late last night of a heart attack after an illness of 6 years. He was 57 years old. Dr. Wiley was an advocate of the modern methods of occupational therapy, and his institution grew from its original single building to 22 buildings on 80 acres of Stanwich property. He and his wife opened the sanitarium in 1906. Blythewood has no locked doors. The patients are encouraged to follow their natural bents, and the sanitarium has become well known for its art school, studios, pottery work, button factory, and many similar projects. The sanitarium has many free patients and formerly had a free psychiatric clinic taken over by the Greenwich Hospital. Dr. Wiley was born in Chester, Pennsylvania, the son of the late James and Mary Wiley. His mother was a member of an old Quaker family. He received his early education in a Quaker school in Philadelphia and later was graduated from the University of Pennsylvania. He was a member of the Field Club, the Indian Harbor Yacht Club, Greenwich, the Lotus Club, the University of Pennsylvania Club, and the Canadian Club. Dr. Wiley is survived by his widow, the nurse, Mrs. Anna Catherine Checkley Wiley, and two children, Mrs. Dorothy Lawson Johnston and William Herbert Wiley, Jr., the latter at present in school in London. But there are some strange things that happen in Blythewood we can't quite explain. Here are a few glimpses of the strange crime taking place at Blythewood from the 1920s until the 1950s. In June 1935, Arthur M. Collins, Jr., 22 years old, son of Arthur M. Collins, president of the Phoenix Mutual Life Insurance Company, disappeared from the Blythewood Sanitarium shortly before 5 p.m. Thursday. His disappearance was made known Friday. Arthur Jr. died shortly after his disappearance. Did he oppose his father's plan at Phoenix Mutual Life Insurance to raise premiums, which is exactly what they did in 1935? Arthur's father actually changed the spelling of his last name after this disappearance to Collins with an I versus an E. Was he trying to hide something? Arthur's father was director of the National Industrial Conference Board and the Government Research Institute, a director of the Life Insurance Association of America and of the Institute of Life Insurance. He founded and managed community chest campaigns, served on the Hartford Hospital Finance Commission, the Advisory Commission for the Connecticut Institute for the Blind, and Hartford University's Art School. So the death of his son appeared to propel him forward versus slow him down. In June 1935, Blythewood Sanitarium attendant Joseph Goodglass's body was found tied alongside 19 others, 2 of which were corpses. 40-year-old Goodglass was wearing an overcoat and had been in the water for 2 months. He was identified by the New York Times as the man who knew too much. Here is the New York Times reporting on the matter. Man dead in sound. Gang link sought. Bound body believed that of Joseph Goodglass. Card bears name of Hydrox Linen Supply Concern. The body of a 40-year-old man found floating 15 feet offshore in Long Island Sound at Port Chester, New York, was tentatively identified as that of Joseph Goodglass, whose disappearance was reported to New York police last April 22nd. The man's legs had been bound with stout sail cord, and Police Chief Leo Brogan of Port Chester said there was no doubt he had been murdered. From the appearance of the body, which was dressed in a winter suit and light topcoat, detectives surmised the murder occurred at least 2 months ago. In the dead man's pockets, the police found $10 in cash, business cards of Joseph Goodglass, president of the Hydrox Linen Supply Company of 16 Hooper Street, Brooklyn, a chauffeur's license issued to him at that address, and a collection of receipted hotel bills. Upon the victim's left wrist was a rectangular gold watch, the hands of which pointed to 11:35. It was recalled when Owen Madden, the gangster, was trying to avoid being sent back to Sing Sing for violation of parole. He said he was employed at Hydrox Laundry. At that time, Israel Levy, the president of the laundry company, denied Madden had any connection with his firm. Efforts to reach Mr. Levy last night were unsuccessful. The body, which was believed to be that of Goodglass, was found at about 11 o'clock yesterday morning by Andrew Romanello, an employee of the Port Chester incinerator, and reported to the local police by William Bauer, manager of the bank's oil company tanks. It was floating face downward. The man's legs were tied together with several wrappings of cord an eighth of an inch thick. Examination indicated the hands too were tied, but the cord had been worked loose. After it was taken from the water, the body was removed to Crast's undertaking to await an autopsy by Dr. Amos Squire, Westchester County Medical Examiner, who returned earlier that day from a visit to Mexico City. Dr. Squire visited Crast's mortuary and made a preliminary examination of the body, later expressing the opinion that the man had been murdered, although the condition of the body was such he could not say if there were knife or bullet wounds. After listening to the description of the victim's bonds as given by persons who saw the body removed from the water, the medical examiner said the man probably had been tied foot and hand overboard and had been thrown overboard with a weight attached, which he then had worked loose. Police records in New York City disclosed that on February 4th, the man who the police believed was tossed from a boat in Long Island Sound was arrested at the Manhattan Towers Hotel and charged with possession of a blackjack. Subsequently, he was discharged in court, but the circumstances surrounding his arrest remain mysterious. On the night of February 4th, detectives of the West 68th Street Station received an anonymous telephone call from a person who said they would find an armed man in Goodglass's room at the Manhattan Towers. Visiting there, they searched Goodglass without finding any weapon on him. A search of his room, however, revealed the blackjack, and they arrested him. In this incident, detectives professed to see circumstantial evidence that Goodglass incurred the enmity of someone seeking vengeance. At the time of his arrest last February, Portchester authorities were informed by New York police Goodglass told them he had just collected $3,500 in part settlement of a claim against former business associates. He sued them for $20,000, he supposedly said. Inquiry at 16 Hooper Street, Brooklyn, disclosed that the laundry company went out of business about 2 years ago. Was Goodglass responsible for the shutting down of this mob front? Goodglass, according to the best information New York detectives have been able to obtain, was last seen alive April 16th, when he left the Hotel Kimberly, Broadway and 74th Street, where he shared a room with a man named Sam Schieber. On that date, he departed wearing a blue suit, blue shirt, tan shoes, and gray topcoat, not a winter suit, and explaining he would be gone a few days on a business trip. 6 days later, his roommate visited the West 68th Street station and informed detectives that his roommate had disappeared. He knew Goodglass as a salesman whose work kept him out at night. The case was reported to Detective Henry White of the Missing Persons Bureau, who was unable to find any trace of the missing man. Upon the finding of the body and its tentative identification as that of Goodglass, Detective White traced Schieber to the Hotel Paris, where he had registered as Samuel Schieber. Schieber was not at home when the detective called to make a positive identification of the body. Another water death occurred in August 1941. The body of Miss Rena Seeley, 45-year-old nurse of 3366 Bronx Boulevard, New York City, was found floating in a swimming pool on the estate of Maurice Wertheim, New York banker. Dr. Ralph W. Crane, Stamford medical examiner, said the death was a suicide. Miss Seeley was engaged to care for the 5-week-old daughter of Mrs. Louise Langman, Mr. Wertheim's daughter, who was living there. Mrs. Langman was originally Mrs. Louise Bonowitz. Maurice Wertheim served on various boards and as a trustee for various organizations. He was the trustee of the Federation of Jewish Philanthropies of New York, Mount Sinai Hospital, and the Nation. He served as president of the American Jewish Committee in 1941 through 1943 and started developing the mergers and acquisitions model to businesses in 1927, creating conglomerates that are harder to sue by the American people. He was a member of FDR's War Production Board during World War II and the founder of Wertheim and Company. Why would a nurse who had been a nurse at Blythewood drown herself in his pool? In November 1935, Mrs. Susan Titan Alexander, 27 years old, of Bernardsville, New Jersey, whose marriage to Archibald Stevens Alexander, a lawyer, was one of the events of the New York social season of 1929, killed herself by jumping in front of a train. We will get into this death a little later. In September 1931, in 2 feet of water in Greenwich's Brothers Brook, 2 golf caddies found the body of Orrin William Jackwish, who had been missing since August 27th from Blythewood Sanitarium on Stanage Road, Greenwich, where he was a patient. O.W. Jackwish Jr., designer of books, catalogs, and advertising, announced 10 years earlier, in July 1921, he would close his studio and start for Europe, visiting the best design in present-day graphic arts. Yet he apparently never learned to swim out of 2 feet of water. Jackwish illustrated the phases of the moon in 1927 and also appears to have been involved in the design of Grand Central Terminal, since that is where his office was. Of course, Grand Central Terminal was the subject of immense greed, and its huge sunlit windows were blocked by skyscrapers in the 1970s. In September 1923, Walter Lewison, member of the wealthy Jewish firm of Lewison Brothers, bankers of 11 Broadway, member of the New York Stock Exchange, New York Cotton Exchange, and New York Coffee Exchange, has been an inmate of the Blythewood Sanitarium for the Insane at Greenwich, Connecticut since May 22nd. It was disclosed on September 12, 1923. He has written many letters to friends and to his attorney begging them to obtain his release. It was revealed at court he was placed at Blythewood only upon deception. 2 physicians approached him on the streets of New York and told him his lover and friend, Leonora Hughes, was in trouble. He went with the doctors and found himself institutionalized at Blythewood. He was categorized as very nervous, and in August 1938 he died at the sanitarium, on the basis of his speculation that escaping fumigation gas probably caused the 3 persons who were supposed to be guarding the door of Sunset Cottage at Blythewood to fall asleep on their posts, and then Lewison died from inhaling the same gas. One source described Blythewood as the dumping ground for the black sheep of wealthy families. But was it also the dumping ground for the mob? Walter Lewison resided in one of Blythewood's several on-campus cottages. According to the Times report, Lewison suffered a mental breakdown following the loss of a considerable part of his fortune from a deal with Jesse Livermore, involving a pool of Seneca copper stock, as he was the director of the Seneca Copper Company, which he let fail. Livermore was a mentee of J.P. Morgan and shorted San Francisco stock before its earthquake, as well as stock before the 1929 stock market crash, making him a solid insider. Did Livermore give Lewison a bad lead? The Seneca copper breakdown had not, Lewison's lawyer tellingly said, been involved for the breakdown of Lewison. Instead, it was occasioned by an affair with dancer Leonora Hughes. Lewison became a patient at Blythewood in May 1923 after he was judged insane by a sheriff's jury. His initial commitment was the subject of heated controversy when Lewison initiated a habeas corpus action in September of 1923, suing for his freedom and telling the press he was held against his will. Lewison, a Yale graduate, later changed his mind and agreed to a voluntary commitment. His 6-figure estate was then managed by a committee appointed by Supreme Court Justice Tierney. His wife, singer Marie Selma, divorced him 5 years later, in March 1928. By June of that same year, she'd remarried and was honeymooning in Spain. She sold their townhome, located at 987 Fifth Avenue, for her own profit. They had been married October 1909 in New York City. She was then Selma Krause, daughter of Maurice J. Krause. They had a son, Walter Pickett, who would attend the University of Wisconsin and Yale. The New York Times reports in its 18 articles on the subject some sort of link between Lewison, his wife, and the investigation of the unsolved 1920 murder of Joseph B. Elwell, the bridge expert and playboy. Elwell pushed for bridge clubs throughout New York City and authored a book on the subject in 1902. As an in-law to the Vanderbilts and the Roosevelts, Elwell was very highly connected. If he had succeeded in his bridge social club scheme, he would have built a new New York City society, focused on connections made at the card table rather than the stock exchange, and probably would have kept alive the Gilded Age a bit longer before the disaster of World War I. But in the early morning hours of June 11th, 1920, Elwell was murdered with a gunshot to the head from a .45 automatic in his locked house in New York City. The murder has never been solved. Elwell was entertained the night before his death by Lewison and his wife at the Ritz-Carlton. They were actually celebrating their divorce, which somehow wasn't finalized until 1928. Elwell knew Lewison through Victor von Schlegel. The von Schlegel family remains active in telecommunications industries and VoIP phone numbers, especially in Colorado. A 1921 confession to Elwell's murder was determined to be the false utterance of a mentally ill man, potentially Lewison taking the hit. Elwell's locked room murder formed the foundation for the Benson murder case novel of 1926, and you can learn more about locked room murders, such as the Broadway Butterfly, on this channel. In 1928, Lewison, one of the heirs to his father's $20 million fortune at the time, perished as the result of entering his cottage when it was being fumigated, despite posted warnings. With 3 tanks of oxygen used on Lewison, he died anyway. His family insisted he died instead due to a long illness. In June 1953, we see that William H. Wiley, the son of the original operator and owner of Blythewood, was under arrest on a charge of operating a mental institution without a license. Sure enough, when we search Wiley's medical licensure with the state of Connecticut, no records are found. In February 1927, Elizabeth Kennedy, a Negro maid from Blythewood, was arrested for stealing a patient's ring, valued at $1,000. In May 1932, Mrs. Mary Marley, an attendant at Blythewood, died at the Greenwich Hospital from injuries received from a car strike on Cos Cob Road, which rendered her unconscious. Michael Lawless, a fellow attendant who appeared to be dating the 52-year-old Marley, said she was struck by a hit-and-run driver, and he then abandoned her body. In February 1928, Watson Franklin Blair, retired Chicago capitalist and grain commission merchant, died of pneumonia in Blythewood, where he had long been a patient. He was 74 years old. Blair was a huge figure in Chicago politics. He withdrew from nearly all his active business connections 37 years before his death, retaining several of his directorships. For 13 years before 1890, he was a member of the grain commission firm Blair & Co., then prominent on the Chicago Board of Trade. Until 1877, he was a partner in Culbertson Blair & Co. beef and pork packers. The Merchants National Bank of Chicago was founded by Blair's father, Chauncey B. Blair, and the son remained on the board of the directors until it was consolidated with the Corn Exchange National Bank in 1902, when he became a director of the larger institution. At the time of this merger, $100,000, millions of dollars at the time, was presented to the employees of the Merchants National. Since 1921, Blair had been deputy governor of the Federal Reserve Bank of Chicago. Blair was vice president and chairman of the Finance Committee of the Field Museum of Natural History, vice president of the Chicago Children's Memorial Hospital, a member of the Chicago Orchestral Association, and one of the governors of the Chicago Art Institute. Alexander Ullman, a former betting commissioner, died in September 1943 at Blythewood. In December 1939, the large gymnasium and recreation building on the Blythewood Sanitarium grounds were burned at a loss of $75,000 when the building was insured for only $20,000. Residents played a game of badminton until 10 p.m. in the gym, and the fire started around midnight. Coscob firefighters attempted to extinguish the blaze. After her husband's death in 1927, Clara Frauenthal, member of the prominent banking family, proponent of the Federal Reserve, and Titanic survivor, went to the Blythewood Sanitarium in Greenwich, where she lived and was treated for depression. She lived there until 1943. In 1929, Joseph Warren, former New York City police commissioner, died of general paralysis in the Blythewood Sanitarium at Greenwich after a gradual decline. A lifelong friend and former law partner of Mayor Jimmy Walker, Warren became the second of 4 police commissioners appointed by Walker during a turbulent period in New York City history, marred by the proliferation of organized crime. Initially hailed by Mayor Walker as the ideal man for the job, Warren's tenure was cut short after only 20 months, following a number of unsolved murder investigations, most notably the highly publicized Jewish mobster Arnold Rothstein murder investigation of November 1928. In accepting Warren's resignation in December 1928, Walker praised Warren as an honest public servant. Warren was only 47 when he died. Blythewood Sanitarium was once a private estate belonging to the notorious boss Tweed, and it opened in 1905 under the direction of the Wileys, including Mrs. Anna C. Wiley, a nurse who proved exceptionally successful with mentally disturbed patients. How could a fancy, large place like Blythewood pay the bills if many patients stayed for free? We know Blythewood was the scene of thefts, hit-and-runs, suicides, drownings, and had a connection to politics via original owner Boss Tweed. Was it also a place where patients were encouraged to end themselves, to spare their families shame and grief? Was it a sort of retirement home for people who had pissed off the elite of New York City? Many patients managed to run away and find themselves drowned or hit by trains. Before Tweed died in 1878, he was the core member of the Democratic Party's political machine that played a major role in the politics of 19th century New York. His corruption was so profound it inspired Teddy Roosevelt to behave differently. Would it have been no big deal for political Hollywood operatives like Louis B. Mayer, a subject on this channel, to pull strings at Blythewood and follow Paul Bern's estranged wife, Dorothy Millette, to and from Los Angeles in the early 1930s? The Times reported a number of walkaways and suicides from Blythewood over the years. In November 1935, Susan Tilton Alexander, the 27-year-old socialite wife of lawyer Archibald Alexander, ended her own life. A Blythewood nurse had taken Mrs. Alexander to a beauty parlor in town to get her hair done. At some point, Mrs. Alexander slipped away from the nurse, walked off, and hid in the bushes next to track belonging to the New York, New Haven, and Hartford Railroad. When a train appeared, she threw herself in front of it. The Times printed a note she'd left for her husband. "I am incurable, and therefore death is better than being a perpetual drag on you." Her husband, Archibald Stevens Alexander Jr., was a high-ranking Democrat. He served as Undersecretary of the United States Army in the Truman administration and as New Jersey State Treasurer. 2 years after his first wife's death at Blythewood, he married Jean Struthers Sears in 1937, who was related to the very powerful Cabot Lodge family. During his second marriage, he rose to very high heights in the U.S. State Department as a powerful globalist, and his rise to power echoes others who experienced loss at Blythewood that doesn't seem to have slowed them down at all. So, what about one of Blythewood's more famous patients, Dorothy Millette Bern? Hollywoodland Forever did an excellent job in covering so much detail, but we dove into the Indiana State Archive for a more thorough look at this woman. Dorothy was born in 1895 in France, according to the 1920 U.S. Census. Did she lie to the census taker while staying at the Algonquin Hotel that year?